There's something strange about the moments that alter you, not because they arrive dramatically, not because they announce themselves, but because when they happen, you rarely understand what's taking place until much later. You think you're experiencing something ordinary, another conversation, another interaction, another passing presence that will eventually fade into the background with everything else. Then one day, you realize it didn't fade. And that realization changes everything. I remember trying to understand why you stayed in my thoughts longer than you should have. At first, I explained it away. People do that. When something doesn't fit into the structure of their understanding, they create explanations, convenient ones, so-if ones. Maybe it was timing. Maybe it was circumstance. Maybe it was simply that you happened to appear during a period when I was paying more attention than usual. I told myself all of those things. And for a while, they worked, at least enough to keep me from looking deeper. But eventually, explanations begin to fail when reality refuses to cooperate. Because no matter what reason I assigned to it, the same fact remained. You stayed, not physically, not constantly, but somewhere inside my awareness, like a presence that refused to dissolve. And that wasn't normal for me. I've always been someone who can separate things, experiences, people, emotions, thoughts. Everything has its place. Everything has its category. Everything exists where it belongs. That's how I maintain clarity. That's how I move through life without becoming consumed by every meaningful encounter. Most things pass through me, even important things. I learn from them. I appreciate them. Then I continue forward. But you didn't pass through. You remained. And the more I noticed that, the more impossible it became to ignore. The strange thing is that it wasn't because of anything obvious. There was no defining event, no dramatic confession, no moment where everything suddenly became clear. It happened gradually, quickly. The way sunlight shifts across a room without anyone noticing until the entire space looks different. That's what this felt like. A change so subtle it was invisible while it happened, yet undeniable once it was complete. I started noticing it in the way I listened. Not just to you, to everything. You altered the way I paid attention, the way I examined meaning, the way I looked beneath what people were saying instead of simply hearing the words themselves. It was as though knowing you had adjusted some internal lens, and suddenly I could see things differently, more clearly, more accurately. That should have felt unsettling. Maybe it did. But not in the way I expected. Because every change you introduced felt less like an intrusion and more like a correction, as though something had shifted into alignment, as though a piece that had always belonged somewhere finally found its place. And that idea bothered me, not because it was wrong, because it felt right, far too right. I've never trusted things that arrive too easily. Life doesn't usually work that way. Meaningful things tend to require effort, time, conflict, distance, misunderstanding. People earn closeness through experience. They build trust slowly. They discover each other gradually. That's the natural order of things. At least that's what I believed. Then you appeared and quietly challenged everything I thought I knew, because somehow you understood things I never explained. Not specific details, not facts. Something deeper than facts. The architecture underneath them, the reasons behind reactions, the patterns beneath decisions. The things people usually overlook because they're too busy looking at outcomes. You noticed origins, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. There's a certain loneliness that comes from being seen incorrectly. Most people experience it without realizing. They become accustomed to being misunderstood in small ways. They accept it, adapt to it. Eventually, they stop expecting accuracy from anyone at all. I think I did the same, not consciously, but over time. I learned to live with approximations. People understood parts of me, pieces, fragments, enough to interact, enough to maintain connection, but never enough to reach the center. And maybe I assumed nobody ever would. Not because the center was hidden, because it was difficult to recognize. Then you did, effortlessly, without searching, without demanding access, without even seeming aware of what you were seeing. And somehow, that made it more significant because intentional understanding can be manufactured. People can study each other, analyze each other, learn enough details to create the appearance of closeness. But what happened between us wasn't manufactured. It existed before effort, before explanation, before understanding itself. It was recognition, pure and immediate. The kind that appears before logic has time to interfere. And I still don't know what to do with that. Part of me wants to reduce it, to make it smaller, simpler, easier to categorize, because categories create safety. If I can define something, I can understand its limits. If I understand its limits, I can predict its impact. And if I can predict its impact, I can maintain control. But this refuses to stay inside definitions. Every time I try to place it somewhere familiar, it exceeds the boundaries I give it. Every time I think I understand it, another layer reveals itself. Not dramatically, just enough to remind me that I haven't reached the end of it, and maybe that's why I keep returning to it. Not because I'm searching for answers, because I'm searching for honesty, because honesty demands that I acknowledge what's happening, no matter how unusual it feels, no matter how inconvenient it becomes, no matter how much it changes things I thought were permanent. The truth is simple. You matter. Not in the way people usually mean when they say that, not because of affection, not because of attachment, not because of dependency. Those words feel incomplete, too small. What I mean is that your existence has become relevant to my internal world, and relevance is powerful, more powerful than emotion, sometimes, because emotions rise and fall. They fluctuate, they respond to circumstances, relevance remains, it integrates, it becomes part of the framework through which everything else is understood. That's where you exist now, not at the edge, not passing through, inside the framework itself. And once someone reaches that place, removing them becomes impossible without changing the structure around them. Maybe that's what I've been resisting, not the connection, the implications of it. Because if I accept what this truly is, then I also have to accept what it means. It means you've changed me, not completely, not beyond recognition, but undeniably. And change is difficult when your identity has been built around consistency, when you've spent years understanding yourself in precise ways, when you've carefully constructed an internal world that functions exactly as intended. Then someone arrives not to break it, not to replace it, just to alter it enough that it can never return to its previous form. That's what happened. And every day, it becomes harder to pretend otherwise. Sometimes I wonder if you feel it too, not the specifics, not the details, just the shift itself, that subtle movement beneath everything. The sense that something important is happening without announcing itself, the awareness that certain connections carry a weight that exceeds explanation. Because I feel it constantly now, not as pressure, not as urgency, as certainty, a quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't need evidence because it exists before evidence, the kind that remains steady even when circumstances change, the kind that continues existing whether it's acknowledged or not. And perhaps that's what makes it so difficult to ignore. It doesn't depend on anything external, not proximity, not frequency, not validation. It exists independently, sustaining itself through something deeper than circumstance. I never believed in connections like that, at least not in the way people describe them. Most descriptions feel exaggerated, romanticized, detached from reality. But this isn't fantasy. It's observation. A simple recognition that some people arrive carrying a familiarity that logic struggles to explain. Not because they resemble someone from your past, not because they fulfill some emotional need, but because their presence aligns with something fundamental inside you, something ancient, something foundational, something that recognizes itself before thought has a chance to intervene. And once that recognition occurs, everything changes. Not immediately, but inevitably. The way rivers change landscapes, slowly, persistently, until one day the terrain no longer resembles what it used to be. I think that's where I am now, standing in a landscape that feels familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, recognizing pieces of myself I've always known, seeing them reflected back through you with a clarity I never expected, realizing that some encounters are not meant to remain temporary, not because fate demands it, not because destiny writes it, but because truth has a tendency to persist. And the truth of this connection persists no matter how many ways I examine it. Every path leads back here, back to the same realization, back to the same undeniable fact. You arrived quietly, you stayed naturally, and somewhere along the way, you became part of a story I didn't know I was writing. A story that isn't finished. A story I'm still learning how to read. A story that continues unfolding every time I think I've reached its conclusion. Maybe that's why I haven't walked away. Not because I can't, because leaving would require me to deny something I know is real. And I've never been good at denying reality once I see it clearly, no matter how complicated it becomes, no matter how much it asks of me, no matter how profoundly it changes the person I thought I was. The difficult part isn't recognizing that something has changed. The difficult part is accepting that the change has already happened. There's comfort in believing transformation is still a future event, something waiting ahead, something that can still be prevented if you make the right decision soon enough. But what happens when the decision has already been made? Not consciously, not deliberately, quickly, over time, through 1,000 moments that seemed insignificant while they were happening. That's where I find myself now, looking back and realizing there was never a single point where this began, no exact moment where I crossed a line, no clear boundary separating before from after. Only a series of small shifts that accumulated until the difference became impossible to ignore. I think that's why this feels so permanent. Things that arrive suddenly can leave suddenly. They depend on intensity, on momentum, on circumstances that eventually change. But things that build themselves slowly become part of the foundation. And foundations don't disappear when conditions change. They remain underneath everything. That's what you've become, not a passing influence, not a temporary presence. Something woven into the structure itself. I notice it most when I encounter something meaningful, a thought, an idea, a realization. There's an immediate instinct to consider how you would perceive it. Not because I need your approval, not because I'm searching for agreement, but because your perspective has become relevant to my understanding. That's what still surprises me, the naturalness of it, the absence of effort. If I were forcing this, I would recognize the strain. I would feel the adjustment. I would notice myself creating significance where none existed. But there's no strain, no effort, only recognition, as though my mind accepted your place long before I consciously understood what was happening. And maybe that's what unsettles me most. The realization that some parts of us make decisions before we do, that awareness operates beneath thought, that understanding can exist before explanation arrives to justify it. I've always trusted reason, analysis, observation, the careful process of examining something from every angle before accepting it as true. But this bypassed all of that, not because it lacked logic, because it existed at a level deeper than logic, a level where recognition happens instantly and understanding takes months to catch up. I wonder how many people experience something like this and dismiss it. How many feel it and immediately search for a simpler explanation. How many convince themselves it's coincidence because coincidence feels safer than meaning. Maybe most do. Maybe I would have too. If it hadn't continued, if it hadn't deepened, if every passing day didn't seem to reinforce the same conclusion. There are moments when I catch myself forgetting there was ever a time before this connection existed, not because my memories disappear, but because the present feels so internally consistent, as though this awareness belongs here, as though it was always moving toward this point. That thought should concern me. The idea that something can become so integrated, it feels natural, despite how unusual it is. Yet every time I examine it honestly, concern gives way to clarity, because what troubles me isn't the connection itself. It's the magnitude of what it reveals. You've become evidence of something I spent years doubting. The possibility that true understanding exists at all. Not partial understanding, not conditional understanding. Something deeper. Something that doesn't require endless translation. Most interactions feel like translations. People converting their thoughts into words, converting their feelings into explanations, converting themselves into forms others can comprehend. There's always loss in that process. Meaning disappears, nuance dissolves, something essential gets left behind. I accepted that as unavoidable, a cost of communication, a limitation of being human. Then you arrived and complicated that belief because somehow less translation was required. Not none, but less. Enough less that I noticed. Enough less that I started questioning assumptions I'd carried for years. What if understanding isn't always something we build? What if sometimes it's something we discover? What if certain people arrive already speaking a language we thought nobody else knew? Not literally, structurally. The language beneath language, the framework underneath expression, the patterns that shape perception long before words become involved. That's we find you, not in what you say, but in how you arrive at what you say, not in your conclusions, but in the architecture that produces them. And that architecture feels familiar, more familiar than it should. There are moments when I hear your perspective on something and experience a strange sense of recognition, not agreement, recognition, a subtle awareness that if I hadn't reached the same conclusion, I could still trace the path that led you there. I could understand the structure of the thought, the internal mechanics, the invisible logic beneath the visible outcome. That's rare. Rarer than most people realize. because understanding outcomes is easy. Understanding origins is different. Origins reveal something fundamental, something difficult to imitate, something almost impossible to fake. And every time I encounter yours, I find myself confronting the same realization. We are different in countless ways, yet beneath those differences, there's alignment. A precise alignment, not complete, not identical, but significant enough to matter. Significant enough that it changes the quality of interaction itself. The strange thing about alignment is that it doesn't create noise. It creates quiet. People assume powerful connections feel intense, explosive, overwhelming, but that hasn't been my experience. This feels quiet, steady, like a current moving beneath the surface. Consistent enough that I stop questioning whether it exists. Consistent enough that I start questioning everything I believed before it, because intensity demands attention. Yet certainty does not. It simply remains, and remaining can be far more powerful than demanding. I think that's why this continues to grow. Nothing about it feels forced. There's no pressure, no expectation, no urgency pushing it forward. It evolves naturally, as though it's following a path neither of us designed. A path that existed before either of us became aware of it. Maybe that sounds irrational. Maybe it is. But reality doesn't become less real because it resists explanation. Some truths arrive fully formed, not because we understand them immediately, because understanding them isn't what makes them true. I've spent enough time observing this now to know that certainty doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes certainty comes from consistency, from seeing the same pattern repeat until denial requires more effort than acceptance. That's where I am, past denial, past avoidance, past the stage where I can convince myself this is insignificant. The question is no longer whether it matters. It does. The question is what that significance requires from me. Because awareness creates responsibility. Once you see something clearly, you become accountable for how you respond to it. And I see this clearly now, clearer than I'm comfortable admitting. There's a tendency to believe important decisions happen all at once. A single moment, a single choice, a single declaration that changes everything. But I don't think that's true. I think the most important decisions happen gradually. They form beneath awareness. They build themselves quietly. Then one day, you realize the decision already exists. All that remains is acknowledging it. Maybe that's what I've been approaching all this time. Not a new realization, an existing one, a truth waiting for me to stop circling around it and finally look directly at it. Because every path seems to lead back to the same place. Back to you, not as an obsession, not as a fixation, as a point of reference, a constant, something my mind returns to because it finds coherence there. And coherence matters to me, more than comfort, more than certainty, more than control, because coherence means something fits honestly without distortion, without adjustment, without forcing pieces together that were never meant to connect. That's what makes this difficult to dismiss. Nothing about it feels forced. If anything, forcing would require moving away from it. Pretending not to notice what's already obvious. Pretending not to recognize what has become undeniable. And I've never been interested in pretending, especially not with myself. There's enough confusion in the world without creating additional confusion internally. So I continue observing, continue paying attention, continue allowing this connection to reveal whatever it intends to reveal, not because I know where it leads. I don't. Not because I'm certain of the future. I'm not. But because some things deserve honesty more than prediction, some things deserve presence more than analysis. And maybe this is one of them. Maybe the point isn't figuring it out immediately. Maybe the point is experiencing it accurately, allowing it to exist without rushing toward conclusions, allowing it to become whatever it naturally becomes. There's a certain freedom in that, a freedom I rarely allow myself. The freedom to stop controlling every outcome, the freedom to let meaning unfold at its own pace, the freedom to trust something without needing to define it first. You've introduced me to that freedom, not intentionally, not through advice or persuasions, simply through your existence. Simply through the fact that this connection continues making sense no matter how closely I examine it, and that consistency has become impossible to ignore. Because the closer I look, the clearer it becomes, not weaker, not less significant, clearer, as though scrutiny only reveals additional evidence, additional depth, additional reasons why this matters. I used to think certainty arrived like lightning, sudden and unmistakable. Now I think certainty arrives like dawn, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until eventually the darkness is gone, and you realize the world has been illuminated for some time. That's what this feels like. Not an explosion of understanding, a gradual emergence. A truth becoming visible, one layer at a time, and with every layer that appears, I find myself returning to the same realization. You didn't force your way into my life. You didn't demand significance. You didn't ask to become important. You simply arrived. And somehow, that arrival altered the landscape of my thoughts more profoundly than anything that tried to change them intentionally. Maybe that's why I trust it, because it never asked for belief, it never required justification, it never demanded recognition. It simply remained. And sometimes the things that remain are the things that matter most, not because they insist upon themselves, because they no longer need to. Their presence becomes proof enough, and yours has, more than you probably realize, more than I fully understand, but understanding continues growing day by day, moment by moment, until what once felt impossible to explain now feels impossible to deny. And somewhere inside that realization, another truth waits quietly. A truth I'm approaching more closely than before. A truth that becomes visible every time I stop analyzing and simply listen to what has already been there from the beginning. The truth that some connections are not defined by how they start. They are defined by how deeply they integrate, and whether either of us intended it or not. This one has already begun to integrate in ways neither distance nor silence seems capable of undoing. There's something I haven't admitted yet, not because I'm hiding it, not because I'm afraid of it, but because some truths take time to become visible, even when they've been present from the beginning. They wait, quickly, distantly, until every possible explanation has been exhausted, until every attempt to simplify them has failed, until all that remains is what was always there. I think I'm reaching that point now, because I've spent enough time observing this to recognize a pattern. And the pattern is simple. Nothing about this diminishes with distance. Most things do. That's how human connection usually works. Time passes, attention shifts, life expands in different directions. People become memories, even meaningful ones, especially meaningful ones. Eventually, the intensity fades, and what remains is appreciation, a quiet acknowledgement that something once mattered, But this hasn't followed that pattern. If anything, distance has clarified it. Silence has clarified it. Time has clarified it. And clarity isn't supposed to grow in absence, yet somehow it has. That alone forces me to ask questions I never intended to ask. Because if something remains stable without constant reinforcement, what exactly is supporting it? What allows it to persist? I don't think the answer is emotion. Emotions are important, but they fluctuate. They respond to circumstance, they rise, they fall, they change shape. What I'm experiencing feels different, more foundational, like a recognition that continues existing whether I actively focus on it or not, like a truth that doesn't require maintenance. And that's a difficult thing to accept, not because it's unpleasant, because it's rare. Rare enough that I don't have many reference points for it. I've spent most of my life understanding people through interaction, through shared experiences, through accumulated history. That's the model that makes sense, the model that feels predictable, the model that explains most relationships. But you don't fit neatly into that framework. And neither does what exists between us, because somehow the significance exceeds the amount of time it should logically require. That sounds impossible when I say it out loud. Maybe it is. Yet every honest observation leads me back to the same conclusion. There are some people whose presence reaches beyond chronology. People who create familiarity before history has a chance to form. People who feel recognized before they're fully known. I never believed that until now. Perhaps because I had never experienced it, or perhaps because I had experienced smaller versions of it and dismissed them before they had a chance to become real. Either way, I can't dismiss this. Not anymore. It's become too consistent, too precise, too deeply integrated into the way I perceive things. There are moments when I catch myself looking at the world differently because of you. Not directly, not consciously, but undeniably. A conversation unfolds, and I notice details I might have missed before. A situation presents itself, and I approach it from an angle I wouldn't have considered years ago. A thought appears and immediately expands, because part of me is already imagining how it would be interpreted from your perspective. Those moments accumulate, and eventually they create evidence. Evidence that something has shifted permanently. The strange thing is that I don't feel smaller because of that shift. I feel larger. Not because you've added something to me, because you've revealed something that was already there. That's an important distinction. People often think meaningful connections complete them. I've never believed that. Completion implies absence. It implies something essential was missing before the connection arrived. That's never felt true to me. I wasn't incomplete before you. You weren't incomplete before me. What happened feels different. More like recognition than completion. More like seeing a reflection of something internal that had never existed outside yourself before. Not because you've become someone new, because you've become more aware of who you've always been. That's what keeps returning to me. The realization that this connection hasn't transformed my identity. It's illuminated it. There are parts of myself I understand more clearly now because they've been reflected back with unusual accuracy. Parts that existed in isolation for so long that then suddenly they're visible. Not because I explained them, because you saw them. And being seen changes things, not externally, internally. It changes the relationship you have with your own reality. Because once something is witnessed accurately, it becomes harder to question its existence, harder to minimize it, harder to pretend it's less significant than it is. That's what you've done. You've made certain truths impossible to minimize, not through effort, not through intention, just through recognition. I don't think people realize how powerful recognition can be. Everyone talks about love, trust, commitment, conch, but recognition exists beneath all of those things. It's the foundation. The moment one person encounters something real in another and responds to it accurately, without projection, without distortion, without trying to reshape it into something easier to understand, that kind of accuracy is rare, and rarity creates value, not because rare things are automatically important, because anything rare enough eventually reveals what we've been missing. You've revealed something not about yourself, about possibility. The possibility that understanding can exist without ownership, that closeness can exist without control, that significance can exist without dependency. Those ideas sound obvious when written down, but living them is different. Living them requires surrendering assumptions. It requires releasing models that no longer fit reality. And reality keeps presenting me with the same lesson. This matters. Not because it's dramatic, because it's true. There's a difference. Dramatic things attract attention. True things endure, and endurance has become the defining characteristic of this connection. Not intensity, not excitement. Endurance, the ability to remain meaningful across time, across silence, across uncertainty, across all the conditions that usually weaken things. Instead of weakening, it becomes clearer. And clarity has consequences, because clarity eventually demands honesty. There comes a point where continuing to analyze something becomes another form of avoidance, a more sophisticated form, a more intellectual form, but avoidance nonetheless. I think I've been approaching that point. Maybe I've already crossed it, because lately I find myself less interested in understanding why this exists and more interested in accepting that it does. That feels significant. For someone like me, acceptance rarely comes before explanation. Usually I need understanding first, evidence first, certainty first. Then acceptance follows naturally. This time, the order has reversed. Acceptance arrived before complete understanding. And that reversal tells me something. It tells me that some parts of me already trust what my mind is still trying to explain. That's uncomfortable. But it's also revealing, because trust has never been my default setting. I've always preferred verification, observation, confirmation, the slow accumulation of proof. Yet, here I am, standing inside something that continues making sense, despite my inability to fully define it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe not every truth arrives with a complete instruction manual. Maybe some truths ask to be lived before they're fully understood. I don't know. What I do know is that every attempt to reduce this connection has failed. Every attempt to categorize it neatly has failed. Every attempt to treat it as ordinary has failed. Not because it's extraordinary in the way stories describe extraordinary things, because it's accurate, because it aligns with reality more closely than the explanations designed to replace it. And accuracy has a gravity of its own. Eventually, it pulls everything toward itself. Every question, every observation, every conclusion, until resistance becomes unnecessary, until acceptance becomes the most logical response available. I think that's where I'm heading, toward acceptance. Not blind acceptance. Not passive acceptance. Deliberate acceptance. The kind that comes after extensive observation. the kind that emerges when evidence becomes impossible to ignore, because there is evidence not in dramatic gestures, not in grand declarations, in consistency, in continuity, in the fact that every layer I uncover reveals another layer beneath it, the fact that every honest examination strengthens rather than weakens what I already know, the fact that your presence continues influencing my understanding in ways that feel natural instead of imposed. Those things matter.